A journalist thought he had the upper hand when he tried to corner Caroline Leavitt live on air about her past. But within minutes, everything would turn around, and no one would be ready for it. Now, imagine this. The studio lights were bright, but cold. Caroline walked confidently toward the platform, moving through the whispers of the audience. Marcus Bennett, sitting at the table, gripped his notes tightly. It looked like an ordinary interview, but Caroline knew this was a trap. Bennett put on a professional smile. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice as confident as ever, but with a hint of sarcasm. "It's an honor to have you here, but let me ask the question on everyone's mind. At such a young age, rising so quickly in the political arena, do you really think this is based on your beliefs? Or did you just say the right things at the right time?" There was a brief silence in the studio. The audience held its breath, waiting for Caroline's response. Caroline's eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle smile tugging at the corners of her lips. If you liked this story about standing firm in your beliefs, don't forget to like and subscribe. Caroline paused for a moment, then tilted her head. This was the moment she had been waiting for. But before answering, there was something everyone needed to understand. The silence in the studio stretched on. Marcus Bennett waited for Caroline to hesitate, but what he expected didn't come. Caroline smiled. "I'm not surprised you asked that, Marcus," she said, leaning slightly back in her chair, "because people like you can't even imagine someone being willing to pay the price for their beliefs." Bennett glanced down at his notes, but Caroline's gaze never left him. "I remember my first job," she continued. "No one gave me a chance. No one took me seriously. But I didn't give up. Because I knew one thing. True belief doesn't come from those who shift when the wind blows, but from those who stand firm despite the storm." Bennett wanted to retort quickly, but Caroline didn't let him interrupt. "If you're really sincere, Marcus, I'm curious," she said, never breaking eye contact. "Have you ever taken a risk for your beliefs?" Marcus Bennett hesitated for a moment. Caroline's eyes already showed she knew the answer to her question, but Bennett wasn't one to give up easily. With a tense smile, he leaned forward and glanced at his notes, his voice no longer as confident. "This interview isn't about questioning my beliefs. It's about addressing your inconsistencies, Miss Leavitt," he said. "For example, how do you explain your rapid rise against those who once said you were ineffective in the political arena? Are you really fighting for what you believe in, or do you just want to be on the winning side?" Caroline tilted her head slightly, letting out a soft laugh. "It's interesting for you to understand, Marcus," she said, her tone laced with subtle sarcasm. "When you see a woman rise through sheer determination, you approach it with skepticism. But when those who are part of the system rise, you don't question them. My answer is simple. I'm not here to win anyone's approval. I'm here to defend what's right." The tension on Bennett's face was visibly increasing. Caroline leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze sharpening. "There's one more thing I want to ask you, Marcus," she said, her voice now firm and resolute. "Do you really think you're an honest journalist?" Marcus Bennett hesitated for a moment. Caroline's eyes seemed to read right through him. The silence in the studio thickened. The audience, almost unconsciously, leaned in a little closer to their seats. Bennett tried to recover. "It's not my personal beliefs that matter here. It's your past," he said. "For example, you made some harsh criticisms before entering politics. Now, you're defending the exact opposite. Is this a transformation or a strategy?" Caroline tilted her head slightly and smiled. "I thought you knew the difference between the change and betrayal, Marcus," she said. "But maybe I was wrong. Sometimes people act based on what they've learned, not just what they've seen." Bennett's face tightened, but he pressed on. "Then let me ask you this," he said. "Is your transformation based on your personal beliefs, or have you been influenced by a greater power?" Caroline leaned back in her chair. "Before I answer that question, I want to hear something from you, Marcus," she said. "Have you ever changed your mind about something?" Marcus Bennett was caught off guard by this question. He couldn't respond right away. The silence in the studio grew heavier. Caroline's words had planted a seed of doubt in the audience's mind. Had Marcus Bennett ever truly changed his mind? Bennett cleared his throat and adjusted his notes. "This interview isn't about discussing my beliefs, Miss Leavitt," he said, trying to shift the focus. Caroline's smile deepened. "Oh, really? How strange," she said. "Because every time you try to remind me of my past, but when it comes to your beliefs, you avoid answering. Interesting." Bennett's face flushed slightly, and a few chuckles could be heard from the audience. But he, trying to regain his composure, shifted to a more aggressive tone. "Well then, let me ask you a clearer question," he said. "You criticized certain policies in the past, and now you're defending the opposite. Is that due to changed beliefs, or just the thirst for power?" Caroline leaned slightly toward her microphone. "If I truly wanted power, Marcus, I'd say things everyone would want to hear. But I chose to say what's right." Bennett opened his mouth to say something, but Caroline continued. "I'm truly curious, Marcus," she said. "Do you think truth is saying what people want to hear, or speaking the things they're not ready to hear?" Marcus Bennett hesitated. His eyes quickly moved to the production team. He realized he was losing control of the conversation. "I'm the one asking the questions here, Miss Leavitt," he said, trying to add an authoritative tone to his voice. "And I still haven't gotten an answer to my question. You say your views have changed, but when did that happen, and why now?" Caroline leaned back in her chair, a slight smile on her face. "Marcus, the truth is that change doesn't happen in an instant," she said. "But for some people, even when the truth is right in front of them, they refuse to see it." The tension in the studio grew thicker. Bennett had thought his questions would corner Caroline, but now the audience was listening more intently to what Caroline was saying. "So, everyone is wrong, and you're the only one who sees the truth. Is that it?" Bennett said with a dismissive expression. Caroline shook her head. "No, Marcus. But at least I've chosen to open my eyes." Bennett slammed his notes onto the table. "Then tell me this, Miss Leavitt," he said. "If you're so sincere, what's the biggest mistake you've made in your past?" Marcus Bennett's question echoed in the studio. The biggest mistake of her past? Caroline stared directly into Bennett's eyes. This was his biggest move. If she lost control here, the direction of the entire interview would change. But Caroline just smiled. "People's biggest mistakes are sometimes their delay in seeing the truth, Marcus," she said. "And my mistake was giving too much goodwill to people like you." Bennett furrowed his brows. "So you don't admit your mistakes?" he asked, impatience in his voice. Caroline shook her head. "On the contrary," she said, "I've never hesitated to admit when I was wrong. But let me ask you something, Marcus. Have you ever admitted that you were wrong?" Bennett paused for a moment. Instead of answering, he glanced down at his notes. Caroline leaned back in her chair. "You love asking questions, Marcus," she said. "But the real question is, when will you admit your own mistakes?" Marcus Bennett's notes no longer mattered. The control of the interview was slipping from his hands, and he knew it. But as a journalist, he couldn't make the biggest mistake. He couldn't remain silent. He took a deep breath, carefully choosing his words. "I'm here to ask the questions, not to answer them, Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice sharp but shaky. "Politicians like you always fabricate stories to justify your past, but our audience is smart enough to recognize fake sincerity." Caroline tilted her head, a smirk playing on her lips. "Is that so?" she said. "Then tell me, what's the best way to truly understand what the audience thinks, Marcus? To tell them what to think or to let them make their own decisions?" Bennett's face hardened. "I'm just putting the facts out there," he said, but his voice wasn't as strong as it once was. Caroline leaned back a little further in her chair. "No, Marcus," she said, her voice calm but unshakable. "You're here to stop people from creating their own truths. But there's something you don't know." Caroline paused for a moment, then turned her gaze directly to the camera. "Truth doesn't change based on what people think, and sooner or later, everyone sees it." The tension in the studio was now impossible to hide. Bennett knew his planned attack had backfired. But he wouldn't give up. He had one last move to make. "Miss Leavitt," he said, trying to gather his composure, "but ultimately, there are points of criticism against you, too. People say you've changed. So what about you? Do you accept that?" Caroline took a deep breath, her unwavering smile still present. "Changed," she repeated. "No, Marcus. I've grown, learned, gotten stronger. When a person sees the truth, they don't close their eyes. Someone who truly believes doesn't change with the wind. They stand firm, even in the storm." The studio was silent. Bennett's prepared questions no longer held any meaning. Caroline stood up from her chair, adjusted her jacket, and turned toward the camera. "If you liked this story about standing firm in your beliefs, don't forget to like and subscribe. Faith, family, and freedom are not just words. They are the foundation of everything we value. God bless you, and God bless America." She then turned and left the studio. The audience rose to their feet. The applause thundered through the studio. Bennett remained silent. He stayed motionless in his seat. His planned trap had completely crumbled with an unwavering principle and a silent display of power. And it proved one thing. Sometimes the best response to arrogance is honor, and the strongest answer to prejudice is truth.